Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated economist here. So many of you have heard me talk about the neutral interest rate. The Federal Reserve neither accommodating nor restricting the economy. It's when they are neutral. Now, this neutral interest rate is not easily observed. You can see it over time, but seeing it in real time is very difficult. Understanding that the neutral interest rate does rise on inflation and inflation expectations, and how that rising of the inflation and inflation expectation pulling the neutral interest rate operates the Federal Reserve's monetary policy by making the economy less restricted. So as the neutral interest rate rises and then the Federal Reserve is lowering interest rates, these two work together and end up making the economy far less restricted than anybody had ever given it consideration for. I mean, even if the Federal Reserve was to stand still and you still had elevated inflation and inflation expectations, it would continue to pull that neutral interest rate ever higher, getting it ever closer to the Fed funds rate and again making the economy less restricted. Now, 8 years ago, John Williams, the New York Fed president, gave a speech called Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World. Many people have heard me talk about this speech on this channel, and I probably have brought it up 1,000 times. It is very important because they had a strategy to deal with the fact that the neutral interest rate was very close to zero. And operating with this interest rate close to zero meant that their monetary policy was no longer going to work with the lowering of interest rates, because when they lowered interest rates to zero, they were not that far below neutral, and it did not give them any room to actually stimulate the economy. And this is one of the reasons why they needed to fire up quantitative easing and forward guidance. It's not new to the Fed strategy to do that. They had planned that literally years in advance. You can find a Ben Bernanke speech. It was titled Deflation, Making Sure It Doesn't Happen Here. In that speech, he described quantitative easing, balance sheet expansion, described it in that manner as a way of combating the deflationary scenario when the Fed funds rate had reached the lower bound of zero. So it wasn't like they didn't know. So they strategized it way ahead of time, and they deliver that strategy in the speeches before the event actually takes place. Very much like the COVID inflationary scenario that we have experienced here and we are still experiencing today. This elevated inflation and inflation expectation that came from the COVID supply chain breakdown, stimulus packages, all that other stuff that everybody freaked out about. This ultimately played right into the Federal Reserve strategy. And if you listen to this particular part within John Williams' speech, Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World, if you listen to this particular part, it just absolutely so telling of what it is that the Federal Reserve not only needed, but got delivered from the COVID pandemic. Listen to this. Today we face an altogether different set of problems stemming from a very low neutral interest rate. Again, that was because that neutral interest rate was close to zero and no more downward adjustment could work. That is the short-term real interest rate consistent with an economy operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation. Ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is a risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high, meaning that they wanted an inflationary scenario that was too high. Why? Because elevated inflation and inflation expectation pulls the neutral interest rate away from the lower bound of zero. Again, the monetary policy is stemming from a very low neutral interest rate. There was an interference there. This speech describes it very well. I'm going to leave a link down in the description to this speech where you can go and read it for yourself and find all the information you need within it. Or you can join us on a Patreon live stream that we are going to be doing here later this afternoon. There will be a link down in the description for that as well. I am going to break this speech down word for word with the current understanding of our situation that we now face today, going back to this speech, which was delivered 8 years ago, talking about the strategies that would be needed in order to conduct monetary policy going into the future, and knowing that this ended up being part of it was an elevated inflation and inflation expectation. It was delivered to them. Here it is. They got it. We're going to break the rest of this speech down word for word so that we have a better understanding of it. And again, by taking in the considerations of what it is that we are now experiencing, going back and listening and hearing the strategies that were being deployed 8 years ago, only to find the results of them today, this is the way that you get the best understanding of the Federal Reserve. Most people think that the Federal Reserve is flying by the seat of their pants, have no idea what they're doing, making snap judgments. And I guess that's okay for their strategies if it works out for them, but ultimately this is a very slow grind that they are methodical about, and that is working. It is definitely working. I mean, consider this one last thing before I end the video, because I don't want to make this too long. Quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4 failed to produce the inflationary scenario that John Williams is writing about here. It was an expansion of the balance sheet of $850 billion to over $4.5 trillion. That amount of money printing on a percentage basis was by far more than what took place during COVID. Now, during COVID, there was more money, but on a percentage basis, quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4 absolutely was by far more money printing than had taken place during COVID. But again, no inflation came from that. Not the inflation that the Fed was looking for. Asset price inflations and stuff like that did, and we can explain why those took off. But really, the inflationary scenario that the Fed was looking for, ultimately coming down into the working class, and the working class getting jobs, hiring, getting consumption coming from the working class, didn't take place. And that's the scariest part of it all, is that the whole system is now breaking down, deteriorating. You can find it taking place with the idea that the consumer is now in the top 20% of households and not really down in the working class. Working class jobs just don't seem to cut it anymore, and the American dream is fading away. Taking these speeches into consideration is by far the best way to understand why it is that we are now facing the consequences of what we are experiencing today, especially if you're on the lower side of the wedge. If you're on the upper side of the wedge, man, you're kicking it and maybe trying to figure out why it is that you're doing so well. Same thing. It's the reasonings that is new money, ever increasing amounts of it pouring into the system. And again, breaking these speeches down word for word is by far the best way to get good understanding for yourself on what it is you need to do. Because the mainstream media and most people who are delivering information out there aren't really getting it right. Listening to the words of the Federal Reserve itself is by far the best way to go about this. So I'm going to end that. And in the meantime, I'm also going to go into another live stream right now on the YouTube channel for members only, the early bird membership. It's $1 a month, so you get access to all the new speeches that are coming out from the Federal Reserve. And we're going to cover a recent Myron speech talking about the regulatory system within the banking, within the banking regulatory system, a speech on that. I think we'll get a better understanding of why it is that we're seeing something like the SOFR rate moving like it is. And so when we listen to these words coming from the Federal Reserve, we then have a better way to internalize the information that we are seeing out there, how to conduct our investments, retirements, our business model plans, where it is that we even get a job. Okay. Links are down in the description. Uneducated Economist. You guys let me know.